Do you really believe that a Philippine nanny can teach something to my daughter? Thomas Wellington's question echoed through his mansion's marble hall in Beverly Hills, loaded with a contempt that made the air look heavier. Isabella Santos, 24, remained standing at the entrance to the luxurious office, holding her folder with educational documents. He had arrived in the United States 3 years earlier with a linguistic and education diploma, but quickly discovered that his formation was worth a little when you needed to work to survive in a country where being an immigrant meant accepting any opportunity. "Mr. Wellington," she said with a soft but determined accent, "I'm here for the tutor's interview for Sophia. I think there's a misunderstanding." Thomas released a cruel laugh as he adjusted the Patek Philippe clock that cost more than most people's annual salary. "Tuto? My secretary said Filipina baby spring. You barely speak English, right? How can you be a tutor of an 8-year-old who needs to master French and Mandarin?" What Thomas did not know was that Isabella had observed closely in recent months the rich American families where she had worked as a nanny. He had noticed the standards, the arrogance, the automatic assumptions about people like her. And above all, he had learned that behind all that ostentation, many of these millionaires were deeply insecure about their own intelligence. In addition, Thomas continued, walking arrogantly around her as a predator, Sophia is being prepared for Stanford. She needs first-class education, not someone who came from a third-world country seeking US dollars. Isabella nodded calmly, but something shone in her dark eyes. For years he had supported comments like these in silence, working as a maid while studying at night, sending money to his family in the Philippines, and being treated as if his nationality automatically determined his intellectual capacity. "I understand your concern, Mr. Wellington. Sophia's education is really important." His voice was too serene, too controlled to someone who had just been brutally insulted. Thomas stopped walking, slightly confused by her calm. "Well, at least you recognize your limitations. I can offer $800 a month to take care of Sophia after school. No teaching, just basic supervision while she does homework." The salary was insultingly low for Los Angeles, but Thomas knew that desperate immigrants would accept anything. What he didn't realize was the discreet smile that formed on Isabella's lips. "Mr. Wellington, before we discuss values, can I ask Sophia's education?" "Of course, be quick. Is she having difficulties with any specific matter?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, his arrogance lightly hesitating. "Well, she has had some problems with French, and the Mandarin tutor costs a fortune and is not bringing results." Isabella nodded with genuine understanding. "And how many languages do you say, Mr. Wellington?" The question took Thomas completely unprepared. For a brief moment his superiority mask slipped, revealing the insecurity he hid for decades. His fortune came from family inheritance, not academic merit, and he had always compensated for his own intellectual limitations, humiliating others. This is not the case. We're talking about you. I speak 9 languages fluently," Isabella said, with a simplicity that made the silence be deafening. "English, Filipino, Spanish, French, Mandarin, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, and German." Thomas blinked several times, processing the information as if she had just said she could fly. Throughout his privileged life, he had used his wealth as a shield against his own intellectual mediocrity. He had never met face-to-face with someone who could expose his limitations so easily. That's impossible," he stammered, feeling for the first time in years he had completely lost control of a conversation. Isabella kept her serene expression, but inside something had been lit. There was another rich man who believed that money was equivalent to intelligence, which nationality determined capacity, that his arrogance could forever hide his own inadequations. "Would you like me to talk to Sophia in French and Mandarin to demonstrate?" She offered a courtesy that somehow made the situation even more devastating. While Thomas struggled to regain his composure, Isabella knew that the time had come to teach another lesson about the difference between inherited wealth and knowledge won, and this time, she wouldn't leave silently. If you have already been underestimated by CA using its origin or nationality, you know exactly what Isabella was feeling at that moment. Subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple language question has become the most educational humiliation that an arrogant millionaire has ever received. The sound of Thomas's heavy breath filled the silence as he tried to process what he had just heard. 9 languages. A 24-year-old Philippine claimed to speak 9 languages when he could barely form a complete phrase in Spanish after 2 decades living in Los Angeles. "This is ridiculous," Thomas finally managed to babble, his voice betraying the insecurity he tried to hide. "You may have memorized a few phrases in each language, but talking fluently is completely different. Anyone can pretend." Isabella watched how he walked nervously through the room, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted objects on the office table. During her 3 years in the United States, she had seen this reaction dozens of times. Powerful men confronted with the possibility that someone who despised could be smarter than them. "Mr. Wellington, can I show talking to Sophia?" Isabella offered calmly. "Maybe she can evaluate me." "No," Thomas exploded, beating his hand on the table hard enough to make the crystal paperweight jump. "Sophia doesn't have to be confused by cheap linguistic tricks. She's being educated by certified professionals, not for people like you." Isabella noted how he paused before "people like you," clearly censoring even more cruel words. It was the same pattern that had observed in other houses. Xenophobia disguised as educational concern, the veiled racism behind academic standards. What Thomas didn't know was that Isabella had specifically worked to get to her home. Through the Philippine Babyish network in Beverly Hills, she had discovered disturbing details about the Wellington family. Sophia was in her 4th nanny in 2 years, all out traumatized by the psychological pressure that Thomas had about anyone who worked at her home. "In addition," Thomas continued, recovering some of his usual arrogance, "my ex-wife made it very clear in the divorce documents that Sophia should be exposed only to appropriate educational influences. I can't risk compromising her development with questionable linguistic experiments." Isabella had read about the troubled divorce of Thomas in local tabloids. Victoria Wellington had left her husband after discovering that he kept a systematic standard of emotional abuse with household employees. The lawsuit had revealed emails where Thomas referred to Latin employees as replaceable and genetically limited to intellectual work. "I understand his concern," Isabella replied, keeping her voice serene despite the growing anger. "But I would like to know, how many tutors, Sophia, have you ever had this year?" The question hit Thomas as a slap. He knew the answer was embarrassing. 5 language tutors in 8 months, all giving up after finding that Thomas constantly criticized his work in front of his daughter, creating a toxic environment that made it impossible for the child to learn anything. This is not your account," he stammered. "The previous tutors did not meet our high standards." Isabella nodded, but mentally recorded defensiveness in her voice. This is exactly what the other babies had reported. Thomas created impossible expectations, and then blamed educators when Sophia, of course, could not learn in a constant pressure environment. "Mr. Wellington, can I ask what is the biggest specific difficulty Sophia is facing?" French? Thomas hesitated again. The truth was that he had no idea of his daughter's specific academic problems because he never really talked to her about her studies. Their interactions merely verified notes and criticized anything below perfection. "She needs to improve the pronunciation," he lied, choosing the most generic answer as possible. Isabella smiled internally. During his family research, he had discovered through a former baby that Sophia actually had a natural gift for languages, but was developing severe anxiety because his father constantly pressured her and never recognized his progress. "And in Mandarin?" "Written. Definitely writing," Thomas responded quickly, again inventing an answer. Isabella realized that he was lied blatantly. It was obvious that Thomas had no real knowledge of his daughter's educational challenges, only the obsession with using her education as a symbol of social status. "Can I suggest something, Mr. Wellington?" Isabella said, assuming a more teacher. "In the Philippines, I grew up speaking multiple languages simultaneously. We learn that children respond better to language learning when the environment is quiet and encouraging, not competitive or punitive." Thomas's face blushed visibly. "Are you suggesting that I don't know how to educate my own daughter?" "No, sir. I only share pedagogical experience based on my formation in linguistics applied by the University of Manila." Thomas blinked several times. "University? Do you have a university diploma? Bachelor of Applied Linguistics and postgraduate in multilingual education?" Isabella responded calmly. "I was also an assistant teacher for 2 years before immigrating." The information hit Thomas as a punch in the stomach. Throughout the conversation, he had automatically assumed that Isabella was an immigrant without formal education, desperate for any work. Discovering that she was more polite than himself, who had abandoned the university in the 2nd year to assume family business, was deeply humiliating. "Why didn't you mention this before?" he asked, his voice sounding strangely acute. "Because the Lord assumed that I was just a nanny and gave me no opportunity," Isabella responded with a brutal honesty that left Thomas without speech. During the embarrassing silence he followed, Isabella observed Thomas fighting internally with her own exposed limitations. It was fascinating to see how men like him reacted when confronted with evidence that his prejudices were not only morally wrong, but factually incorrect. "Well," Thomas finally murmured, "Philippine diploma is not exactly equivalent to American standards." Isabella smiled for the first time in the conversation. a smile that didn't come to the eye and was somehow more intimidating than any expression of anger. Interesting perspective, Mr. Wellington, especially considering that my university has a partnership with Stanford, Berkeley, and Harvard for applied linguistics research, but I completely understand its cultural perspective on international education. Each word was pronounced with surgical precision, loaded with meanings that left Thomas completely disarmed. For the first time in decades, he was in a conversation where he was clearly the least intelligent person in the room. Isabella knew that the time had come to reveal exactly who she really was, and what she had found about Thomas Wellington during her careful months. Lord Wellington, before we continue, would like to ask a personal question. Do you really believe you can educate Sophia about languages when you are clearly afraid of people who speak more tongues than you? The question echoed the mansion as an impossible challenge to ignore. Thomas realized that he had severely underestimated that Philippine woman, but she still did not imagine that her prejudiced words were being carefully documented by someone who would turn her own arrogance into the weapon of her social destruction. Thomas Wellington felt the blood climb to his head. For 42 years of privileged life, no one had ever publicly questioned their authority or intelligence, and now this Philippine was suggesting that he was fear of smarter people than him. Fear? He growled, completely losing the composure. I built a $200 million real estate empire. Do you think I'm afraid of a nanny who can barely pay his own work visa? Isabella carefully observed how Thomas revealed more about himself with each explosion of anger. It was fascinating to see how powerful men decompensated when confronted with their own limitations. Every cruel word that came out of his mouth was being mentally registered. Mr. Wellington, she said with supernatural calm, if you allow, I would like to show my competence talking to Sophia. I promise it will be just an educational assessment. No, Sophia is not here today. She is in a commitment. Isabella knew it was a lie. During his research, he had discovered that Sophia spent every afternoon on Monday at home after school, because Thomas fired the previous nanny without hiring a substitute. The 8-year-old was probably watching television upstairs right now. I understand. Maybe another time, Isabella agreed, but something in her tone suggested that she knew exactly where Sophia was. Thomas walked nervously to the panoramic window that led to Beverly Hills, trying to recover control of the situation. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the Italian tie. My proposal remains, he said, trying to sound authoritarian. $800 a month for basic supervision. Without teaching, without linguistic experiments, no progressive ideas about education the child. Isabella nodded, but internally smiled when she realized that Thomas had further reduced the salary offered during her own insecurity. It was a classic pattern. When they felt intellectually threatened, men like him tried to resign power through financial control. Mr. Wellington, can I ask a personal question? It depends on the question. Why did you really divorce Victoria? The question hit Thomas as a shot. Her eyes narrowed dangerously as she processed how Isabella knew intimate details about her personal life. This is not your subject. Of course not. Just curiosity, because I read in the public documents of the court that she cited systematic pattern of discrimination and emotional abuse against domestic employees as one of the reasons for divorce. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas realized with growing horror that Isabella was not a desperate immigrant who had stumbled at his home by chance. She had done research. She knew things. Where did you get information about my divorce? Court's public records are accessible to anyone, Mr. Wellington, especially when the case involves allegations of ethnic and racial discrimination against domestic employees. Isabella watched Thomas gradually pale. During his months of preparation, he had studied not only the official divorce documents, but also talked extensively with 3 former babas from Sophia. All reported the same pattern: systematic humiliation, racist comments, under minimum wages, and degrading working conditions. Are you investigating me? Thomas asked, his voice sounding strangely acute. No, sir. I just did what any responsible professional would do before working with a child. I researched the family to better understand the environment where I was working. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, but Thomas knew there was something else. The way Isabella spoke, confidence in her gestures, the accuracy of her questions, everything indicated a level of planning that went far beyond a simple job research. And what else did you discover in your research? He asked, trying to sound sarcastic but failing miserably. That Sophia is a brilliant child who is developing learning blocks due to the stress of constantly disappointing a father who pressures her without providing emotional support. Each word was a precise stab. Thomas knew it was true but had never heard someone so clearly articulate what he did with his own daughter. I also found out, Isabella continued, that the Lord had 5 different babies for Sophia in the last 2 years. 3 of them have left without notice. One was fired by incompetence, and one is still processing the Lord for racial discrimination. Thomas felt the world spinning. How did this woman know in detail that not even her own lawyers openly argued? "What do you want?" he asked, abandoning any pretense of being in control of the conversation. Isabella smiled for the second time in the conversation, and again it was a smile that did not convey joy, but something much more complex and powerful. "I want to help Sophia learn languages in a healthy and natural way. I want her to develop confidence in her own intellectual skills, and I want you to understand that educational competence has no nationality, color, or accent. What if I say no? Then you continue to look for tutors that accept to work in an environment where they are constantly disrespected and underestimated, and Sophia continues to develop academic anxiety because she confuses pressure with support." Thomas realized he was trapped, but he still did not completely understand the scope of what Isabella had planned. "There is one more thing, Mr. Wellington," Isabella said, taking a small digital recorder from the folder. "During our conversation today, I recorded some interesting comments about their perspectives on international education and Philippine immigrants." Thomas's blood froze. Did you record me without permission? In California, only one person needs to consent with conversation recordings. I consent to myself." Isabella kept the recorder calmly as she watched Thomas process that each prejudiced comment, every ethnic insult, each demonstration of arrogance, had been documented. "What do you intend to do with it?" "This depends entirely on the Lord, Mr. Wellington. If you accept my work proposal with just terms and professional respect, these recordings remain archived as a guarantee of a decent work environment." Thomas finally understood that he had fallen into a carefully built trap. Isabella Santos was not a desperate immigrant. She was a strategist who had studied her fraquezas and prepared a devastatingly intelligent response. While Thomas struggled to prosecute how he had been completely overcome by someone who had automatically despised, Isabella knew that the most satisfactory part of her plan was yet to come, because what Thomas didn't imagine was that the recording was just the beginning of a lesson about respect that he would never forget. "No!" Thomas shouted, his voice echoing through the mansion with an intensity that made Isabella step back. "You can't do this to me. I have lawyers, I have connections, I have power," Isabella calmly observed as the man who a few minutes ago despised her for her nationality now begged for mercy. It was fascinating to see how arrogance became despair when confronted with real consequences. "Mr. Wellington," she said, taking the phone out of her bag, "I would like to show something interesting." On screen appeared an Instagram page with thousands of followers. "Justice for domestic workers." Isabella slid to show detailed posts on abusive bosses in Beverly Hills, each accompanied by meticulously documented evidence. "Do you have a social network dedicated to exposing abuse?" Thomas asked, his voice sounding strangely acute. "Not just me. We are a community of domestic workers, babysitters, and tutors who systematically documents the treatment we received. Your 3 former babas contributed extensively to our file about you." Isabella showed screenshots of conversations where Thomas referred to Philippine employees such as genetically inferior and replaceable. There were pictures of the tiny rooms where the babysitters slept, prints of messages where he threatened deportation for insubordination, and audio recordings of their verbal explosions. Where did you get that?" Thomas stammered, recognizing his own words being used against him. "Carmen, your second nanny, kept all the cruel text messages you sent. Rosa secretly documenting degrading working conditions, and Maria still has the audio of when you shouted that third world people should not question civilized Americans." Thomas felt the world spinning. Every humiliation that had inflicted, every racist commentary that had thought to be private, every demonstration of abusive power, everything had been carefully preserved as evidence. "What do you want?" he asked, abandoning any pretense of dignity. Isabella smiled for the third time in the conversation, a smile that finally came to the eyes. "Justice and education." She showed another phone screen. "This video already has 2.3 million views in 48 hours. On the screen appeared Thomas at a charity party from the previous drunk week, making cruel jokes on how to train Asian maids, while other manas from Beverly Hills Ryam. One of the waitresses had discreetly filmed the whole scene. "My God, this will ruin my reputation," Thomas whispered. "Are you?" Isabella asked rhetorically. "Let's look at the comments." She started reading aloud. "This man is a sociopath. How can someone like this can raise a child? Boycott Wellington properties. Someone needs to warn his ex-wife." "Stop, please," Thomas begged. "But the best is yet to come," Isabella continued relentlessly. "Victoria, her ex-wife, saw the video. She contacted us yesterday." Isabella showed a new conversation on WhatsApp. "She wants to completely revoke her custody of Sophia. Apparently the recordings we have confirm their worst suspicions about her character. Thomas collapsed in the executive chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Sophia. No, she's my daughter. It's an 8-year-old that you systematically traumatizes while using your education as a status symbol, Isabella responded coldly. Victoria is right to protect her. What do I need to do for you to stop? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. Isabella put the phone and stared at him directly. First, you will retroactively pay fair wages to all babysitters who have worked here in the last 5 years. $50,000 for each as compensation for moral damages. Second, you will finance a program of university scholarships for daughters of immigrant domestic workers, $100,000 a year for 10 years. Third, you will make a public statement apologizing for your discriminatory comments and announce your commitment to ethical labor practices. Thomas calculated mentally. I was talking about over $1 million. What if I do all this? Do you delete the video? Isabella laughed genuinely for the first time. Mr. Wellington, the video remains. The internet never forgets. But if you do our conditions, we will not publish the even more compromising audio recordings we have. What recordings? Your Con V telephone arrow on how to deport problems and their comments on Keep Asia instead. Recordings that the FBI would find very interesting, considering federal laws against discrimination and threats to immigrants. Thomas realized that he was completely cornered. Every way out he imagined was blocked by evidence that Isabella had methodically collected for months. Why did you do that? He asked, genuinely confused. Why do I work so much to destroy me? Isabella leaned forward, her eyes shining with an intensity that Thomas had never seen before. Because men like you believe that your wealth gives you the right to treat other people like garbage. Because you represent everything rotten into a system that allows privilege to become cruelty. And especially, she continued, because Sophia deserves a father who loves her for what she is, not that she uses it as a trophy to impress other racists. Thomas finally understood that he had faced something much larger than a simple, vengeful nanny. He had collided with an organized movement, a network of women who had turned years of systematic humiliation into a social justice machine. While Thomas reluctantly signed every document Isabella put before him, the realization of what she had lost, not just money, but the possibility of being respected by her own daughter, she was beginning to penetrate her privileged conscience. But the hardest lesson was yet to come when he found out that Isabella had kept the best for the end. 6 months after the confrontation that would forever change the life of Thomas Wellington, Isabella Santos was sitting at her new office in downtown Los Angeles. The plate at the door said, Santos Educational Consulting, Executive Right. But what really mattered was the panoramic view of the city that once seemed inaccessible to him. Congratulations on the story at Forbes, said Victoria Wellington, entering the room with Sophia by the hand. Thomas's ex-wife had become not only a client, but one of the greatest advocates of Isabella's work. Sophia, now 9, ran to hug Isabella and immediately began talking to Mandarin fluent, a progress she had never achieved with the expensive tutors that her father hired. In just a few months working with Isabella, the girl had discovered her true passion for languages when she finally found someone who taught patiently instead of pressure. How is Thomas? Isabella asked, observing Sophia draw Chinese characters with cheerful concentration. Victoria sighed with a mixture of penalty and satisfaction. He has completely lost his custody, as you know. His company is facing 3 federal lawsuits for discrimination, and he had to sell 2 properties to pay the labor fines. But the worst for him is that no one else wants to work at his home. The home network has created a blacklist. Isabella nodded, but there was no cruelty in her expression. She had learned that true justice was not about destroying people, but about creating consequences that forced real changes. And the bag program? Victoria asked, sitting comfortably. Film applications in the first month, Isabella replied, showing data on her laptop. We'll be able to finance higher education for 100 young people this year. Daughters of babysitters, cleaning, cooks, all with dreams that were invisible before. The phone rang, and Isabella answered in Filipino, then in Spanish, and finally in English. It was an interview with CNN International about its educational consultancy that now served families in 6 countries. My mother is proud, Isabella said, after turning off. She always said that education is the only inheritance no one can steal from you. Now I understand that she meant that she is also the only weapon that can never be used against us. Sophia lifted her eyes from the drawing. Isabella, why was my father as cruel to people like you? The question echoed through the silent room. Victoria tensioned, clearly concerned about explaining the complexity of prejudice to a child. You know, Sophia, Isabella said softly, crouching at the girl's level, Sometimes people who feel small inside try to feel big, making others feel smaller. His father was not happy with himself, so he tried to find happiness doing others unfortunate. And now, is he happier? Isabella considered the question carefully. I don't know, honey, but I know you are, and your mother is, and hundreds of other children are having opportunities they wouldn't have before. Sometimes when people do bad things, others need to work extra to create good things. Sophia nodded with the seriousness of those who were processing complex concepts. How I've been teaching real languages, not shouting. Just like that. Later that day, Isabella received an unexpected message. It was from Thomas Wellington. After 6 months of total silence, he had finally found words. Isabella, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need to know that you changed my life so that I never imagined possible. I lost everything I thought I mattered, and found that none of that really mattered. I'm in therapy, working with a support group for people with discriminatory behaviors, too blind to see. I hope Sophia will grow up remembering how a strong woman defended her dignity better than her own father has never done. Isabella read the message twice, then kept her without responding. It was not about him deserving forgiveness. It was about her to have overcome the need for her validation. In the office mirror, Isabella saw the reflection of a woman who had turned humiliation into power, prejudice into opportunity, and disdain into dignity. For years, people like Thomas had treated her as invisible. Now his story inspired thousands of immigrants around the world. The phone rang again, a family of San Francisco wanting his educational services. Then it would be a video conferencing with educators in the Philippines. Then an interview with the BBC on discrimination in the American labor market. Thomas Wellington had tried to reduce Isabella to a stereotype. Instead, it has become an example that intelligence, determination, and dignity have no nationality, accent, or postal code. The best revenge, Isabella had learned, was not to destroy who had underestimated her. It was to build something so great that they made their opinion completely irrelevant. Thomas tried to humiliate Isabella because of his origin, but eventually created the platform to become a global voice for educational justice. Isabella has learned that true revenge is not to make her small enemies. It is growing so much that they simply stop importing. If you have already been underestimated because of its origin or nationality, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that our true strength is what we know, not what others think we are.